All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to unpack a huge story of economic transformation. It's a journey that starts with an economy that was basically rewired for colonial profit, and then follows its path through these really ambitious and sometimes pretty painful experiments in building a new nation. This is the story of India's economic journey.
Okay, so here's our game plan for tracing this history. We're going to start back in the colonial era to see exactly how the economic engine was built to benefit Britain, which led to the famous drain of wealth. Then we'll look at how independent India fought back, first by rebuilding its farms, and then by trying to forge its own industries. And finally, we'll land in the present day to take a hard look at the unfinished parts of this incredible story.
You know, to really get a grip on modern India, you have to go back to the very foundation of its economy, the land itself. The British didn't just rule India, they fundamentally re-engineered the entire country's relationship with agriculture. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around today, but before the British arrived, land wasn't just a commodity you could buy and sell. Ownership was tied directly to whoever was actually farming it. The local chiefs, the zamindars, they were basically just tax collectors. They weren't the outright owners of the land. But then, everything changed. The British rolled out 3 new land revenue systems. Now, whether it was the zamindari system, which turned those tax collectors into powerful landlords, or the Ryat-Wari system, where the state just collected taxes directly, the end game was always the same. Land became a commercial good, and all that revenue was funneled to benefit the colonial state.
And the impact of these changes? It was absolutely devastating. With these super high, rigid taxes, farmers just fell deeper and deeper into debt, which gave rise to this powerful new class of moneylenders. Landlords were often living in cities, so they had zero incentive to actually invest back into the land. So what happened? Productivity tanked. Millions became landless laborers, and the shift to cash crops to pay rent often led to brutal, horrific famine. And look, this wasn't just about what was happening out on the farms. This re-engineering of the Indian economy went way deeper. The entire system was basically reoriented to serve Britain's interests. And this is what became known as the Great Wealth Drain.
The person who first put a name to this was Dadabhai Naoroji, a really important early Indian nationalist. And his drain of wealth theory? It was a bombshell idea at the time. He was arguing that India's poverty wasn't because of some internal failing. No, he said it was a direct result of this massive, one-way flow of wealth from India straight to Britain.
So how exactly did it work? Well, there were a few key ways. First up, trade. Indian tax money was used to buy Indian goods, which were then exported, but the profits never came back to India. Then you have these things called home charges. Get this. India was forced to pay for its own occupation, funding the salaries of British officials all the way back in London. And even huge infrastructure projects like the railways were designed to make British investors rich, with guaranteed high returns and all the equipment imported from Britain. The total effect of these policies is just staggering. In 1800, India was responsible for about 20% of all world trade. By the time of independence in 1947, that number had completely collapsed to just 2%. A once thriving economy had been systematically hollowed out. Okay, so fast forward to 1947. India's independent, but its new leaders are facing this absolutely monumental task. They've inherited a broken agricultural system and a population on the brink of starvation. So the question was, where do you even begin to fix something this broken? I mean, it's a massive question, right? The new nation's answer came in 2 huge, bold, and actually very different experiments. First, they tried to restructure who owned the land. And second, they tried to revolutionize the technology used to farm it.
The first experiment, land reform, was incredibly complicated. The goal was to break the power of those big absentee landlords created under the British. And on one hand, it did succeed in tearing down those old feudal structures. But on the other hand, the laws often had loopholes, which led to mass evictions of tenant farmers. It was a necessary step, for sure, but the results were a real mixed bag.
Now, the second experiment was all about technology, the Green Revolution. And wow, you can literally see the impact right here on this graph. After decades of just flatlining, agricultural growth suddenly shoots straight up in the late 1960s. This was a massive, state-led push to introduce high-yield seeds, fertilizers, and modern irrigation.
And the bottom line is, this was a total game changer. The Green Revolution turned India from a country that was completely dependent on international food aid, literally a ship-to-mouth existence, into a nation that could actually feed itself. It was, without a doubt, one of independent India's greatest achievements.
But, feeding the nation was just one piece of the puzzle.
India also had to build an industrial base from scratch, something the British had actively prevented. So let's take a look at that journey.
This timeline really lays it out perfectly. You can think of India's industrial story as a three-act play. Act 1, a phase of state-led development, with the government building all the heavy industries. Act 2, a long period of stagnation under this system of heavy regulation. And then Act 3, a dramatic pivot in 1991 towards an open, liberalized economy.
That middle period, it became infamous as the License Raj. Now, the intention was supposedly to make sure development was balanced. But what it really meant was you needed a government permission slip for just about everything. And this system, more often than not, just led to inefficiency, corruption, and ended up concentrating power in the hands of a few.
Then came 1991, and it was like economic shock therapy. The License Raj was dismantled almost overnight. Industrial licensing was just gone for most sectors, and the number of industries reserved only for the government was slashed from 18 down to just 3. It was a complete 180 from the policy of the previous 40 years.
All right, so after all this, these huge dramatic swings from one economic model to another, where does that leave India today? What does the final balance sheet of this long journey actually look like?
Well, it's really a story of two sides of the same coin. On one hand, you have these incredible successes. India achieved food security, it built a diverse economy. But for every one of those successes, there's a really stubborn challenge. The Green Revolution, for example, created huge regional imbalances and led to serious environmental problems. And even though the economy has grown, the crisis of farmer debt is still a massive political and social issue.
And this chart really gets to the heart of one of the biggest challenges today. After that big push in the 60s and 70s, public investment in agriculture as a piece of the whole economy has basically flatlined. Many people argue that the rising cost of subsidies has crowded out the kind of long-term investment in things like irrigation and research that India needs for its next wave of growth.
Which brings us to our final thought, and it's a big one. India's economic history isn't a simple straight line. It's this series of massive nation-defining experiments. They went from a colonial market to a state-controlled system and then to a globalized one. The crucial question for India's future is, what's the next grand experiment going to be?